Hey folks, Michael Mann from Michael Mann Security Services. Welcome to Response to Civil Unrest, the Rules for Self-Defense. Folks, as we talk about this, we're talking about self-defense, and let me explain what self-defense means for us, the citizen. You're going to see some disturbing things on videos tonight that I'm going to point out about what the police will and cannot do. We glanced over it last week. We're going to talk about it in detail tonight. Self-defense, the best way to put self-defense, Clint Smith said this. Clint Smith from Thunder Ranch. Self-defense is basically finishing something that someone else started. Let me say that again. We talk about self-defense. It is finishing something that someone else started. It is important that you understand what this means, especially if you're a church security team. So if we got our church security teams joining us tonight and you're watching this, I'm going to address that specifically as we get into the scenarios. Before we get into videos, I'm going to talk about church security because there's some stuff out there we've seen on Facebook pages asking questions about destruction of property. What does that mean? I'm going to go over that quickly. And even with the church security team, because you are citizens, you're civilians, just like I am. Self-defense is finishing something that someone else started. Okay? All right. So let's get into, very quickly, risk mitigation. Protection is about risk mitigation, even in self-defense. The last thing we want to do is defend ourselves. Not because we don't want to get hurt, but what I mean is last week we talked about the basic protection model, and we talked about awareness, avoidance, and defense is always last. In the situations we're going to talk about tonight with civil unrest, you can avoid it. And we're going to show you some videos and hear some things where we'll walk through the process where it was not avoided. Risk transfer. That means that we transfer or give that risk to somebody else. In our case, especially like if you're a concealed carry permit holder, you're standing post somewhere for a church, you're in the executive protection field, that's going to be like prepaid legal insurance. Okay? That's an example. And then risk reduction are those measures that we take to reduce the risk. We reduce it as low as possible. Now, there's other things we can do with risk. We can separate risk. There's other things that we can do, but we're talking about self-defense. This is what we're going to look at, these three elements with risk mitigation. Now, there are two risk assessments when we talk about risk mitigation that you should start to look at when we start talking about civil unrest and putting yourself in a situation or being in a situation in a mob where you may have to defend yourself or somebody else. Number one is, let's talk about the risk assessment first. Remember, risk, and when we assess it, is always based on intent, right? Or that likelihood or probability of this occurring to you, like the problem occurring to you. Number two is vulnerability. That is a system weakness, something that we're not doing that makes us that makes us weak or vulnerable to this thing that we're worried about, this attack. Okay? And then there is always consequence. That is the impact of what happens if this occurs. So two risk assessments that you need to think about for yourselves, for your facilities, and for the people that are there. Number one is the risk assessment based on your exposure to civil unrest and the mob. And we're gonna show you some videos again later, and you're going to hear some things about risk assessment and thinking about those things before you get into that type of situation. What do I need to do? What's the risk? Where do I need to lessen my vulnerability? What's the consequence? And what's the probability of this occurring? This always gets into our vulnerability. How we lessen the risk, that risk level is going to be the vulnerability, the system weaknesses, how we reduce this. Then there's the assessment of that risk assessment on the use of deadly force. And when we talk about that, number one, what's the situation? And what's the likelihood for us to have to use deadly force in this situation? What does that look like? If we have to use deadly force, what are our system weaknesses? What are we doing? What are we not doing? Like legally, how are we going to be vulnerable? And then also, what's the impact or consequence? What's that personal consequence to you if you have to use deadly force? You are legally, morally, and financially responsible for the final resting place of every projectile if you're using a handgun or a rifle that you fire that you launch out of a firearm, whether that's a handgun, rifle, shotgun, whatever. And so there are consequences to that. So the two risk assessments I want to look at before we even get into deadly force, or you need to look at, is that risk of you being involved in some sort of a situation where you're in the mob, and you might get attacked or something bad will happen. And then, of course, that risk for you having to use deadly force or defend yourself. And remember, again, self-defense is finishing something that someone else started. That is the way that you have to look at this legally. So when we start talking about personal threat assessments, what's the intent of that threat? What's the intent of that mob or that person? What's their capability? And then, of course, what's that frequency of that history look like when we get into the middle or these things happen? Okay? So think about that as we go through this process, especially at the end when we start talking about these scenarios of the videos we're going to show you. Okay, so as a citizen, we can protect ourselves from harm under appropriate circumstances. Now, I live in Tennessee. I live in Brentwood, Tennessee, just outside of Nashville. It's a suburb. So we have, obviously, we're following Tennessee Code Annotated. If you have questions very specific about your state after this, I suggest you go to your state laws and you look those up. But in general, in any state in the country, you have the ability to protect yourself from harm under appropriate circumstances. Now, when we think about this, I want you to think about two words. Number one, innocence. And number two, righteousness. You must be innocent and you must be righteous to defend yourself. Now, some of you guys or some of you folks may be out there thinking, well, if I'm attacked, I can use what force is necessary to neutralize a threat. You're absolutely right. But as you start to look at this, this is a problem for you. You need to think about innocence and righteousness. You have to be 100% sure that whatever you do in this situation is going to be both based on innocence, something that you did not do, you didn't cause it, and at the end, everything you did was righteous under the law. To get that plea or to get a judge or to get a grand jury to say, yes, this was self-defense, I can't provoke it, and I can't instigate it. So what this means is, look, a situation, they're tearing down statues. There are statues that they're tearing down. I don't think they should tear down. I don't think it's right. If you're going to go out to this place and you're going to watch that, it'd probably be wise not to get into an argument with the folks doing that or instigate or provoke anything. Okay? Number two, you can't start the fight. In any way, you cannot start the fight. To be innocent and to be righteous, you can't start it. So you can't provoke it, you can't instigate it, you can't start it. And you can't escalate the fight. At any time, when that opposing force starts to lessen, you also have to de-escalate. So I can't escalate the fight either. I want to be righteous, I want to be innocent. This is how we get a claim of self-defense under the law. Again, when we think about deadly force, any force likely to intend to cause death or serious bodily injury, it could be hands or feet, it could be a car, it could be a blunt object, it could be a firearm, it could be an edged weapon. Okay? So let's talk about what death is. What is death? Now, I'm going to quote some Tennessee law, but in general, most of the states follow this. But let's talk about what is death. So what does death mean? So if deadly force is any force likely to or intended to cause death or serious bodily injury, what is death? Heart stops beating, blood stops pumping, or stops pumping. That's death. That's clinical death. In serious bodily injury, substantial risk of death based on the situation, protracted unconsciousness, again based on situation, extreme physical pain, and or disfigurement. All right? Deadly force is always a last resort. Let me say that again. Deadly force is always a last resort. It is to be used only when all lesser means have failed or cannot be reasonably employed. It is the last thing that you do. It's why on the basic protection model, when we talk about its awareness, avoidance, defense is always last. As a citizen, you will be held to a higher standard. We're going to show you some videos later on with some language from the media that proves that if you have to use deadly force, you will not be looked at the way someone else is. You're going to be held to a higher standard in that court of public opinion. So I want to reduce my risk of being involved in any of this at all. If I can, I want to avoid the use of deadly force. And even put myself in a situation or be in a situation where I might have to use deadly force. When we start to talk about a last resort, what we talk about is, look, avoid or escape. And so if you don't know what intermediate weapons or tools that we use when deadly force is not going to be applicable, but the use of empty hand control is not going to work. So I can't control them with my hands. Okay? So we talk about intermediate weapons. In this case, we're talking about oleoresin capsicum or OC spray, batons, tasers, etc. We're talking about when I can't use those because the level of force is at a level, or you're in a situation where deadly force is going to be authorized. Okay? So again, a last resort. It's when I can't avoid it, I can't escape it, I can't call for help because I don't have time, or maybe help's just not going to come. We're going to see that later on. Or where intermediate weapons are just not going to be appropriate. They're not going to solve the problem. Circumstances. Again, this is Tennessee law. In most states, the circumstances are the same. Number one, self-defense. There are certain myths in states around the use of deadly force. Things like, oh, someone's in my house, I can shoot them. Oh, if they fall on the porch, I can drag them inside my house. All of these things are not true. And so what I would tell you is this is general based on the state of Tennessee where we are. You need to research the rules for a citizen's use of force or deadly force in your state. Okay? So, number one, self-defense, protection of myself. Based on a reasonable belief, which means I'm going to have to articulate or explain this to somebody, of imminent or immediate danger of death or serious bodily injury. We've already talked about what that is. So the circumstances, self-defense or protection of self, and protection of somebody else. But again, there has to be reasonable belief of imminent danger of death or serious bodily injury, and you are going to have to explain that to someone. Someone's going to ask you a question, and at some point you are going to have to answer it. All right? So we got into this last week when we start to talk about the standards. The three elements that you have to be able to use deadly force. Not one or not two, you must have all three. Ability, opportunity, and jeopardy. Now, when we get into ability, something to remember here in just a second. There's something called disparity of force. And disparity of force basically means I can use deadly force against an unarmed person, or that's the understanding of it under the law, okay? When we teach self-defense, police officers teaching it to security personnel, whoever, when we get into disparity of force, the way we talk about it is escalating factors. So we talk about the person that we're using deadly force against is unarmed. We mean that one, like it could be that they are bigger than we are and stronger. It could be like an adult using physical force against a child. Okay, so that might be an escalating factor of disparity of force. Another disparity of force may mean there's more than one person attacking you. So when we're talking about the mob, if you can articulate that and explain that in the situation, it means there's more than one person attacking. Okay, another element of disparity of force might be like positioning. You're at a tactical disadvantage. So that could mean like you're inside of a building and there are people outside, and this is an example because this is based off case law. People are like throwing stuff through the window and they're trying to get to you to kill you, or you think they are, and somebody else inside. Or positioning could also be where you're inside of a vehicle. So think about being cramped up in a confined space, seatbelt on, and people are trying to get to you. So you're at a position of disadvantage because you can't defend yourself from inside that car with your hands. So those are all escalating factors, or those are elements of disparity of force when we talk about ability. And that, when we talk about ability, is an exception. Okay? Again, I must have all three, not just one, not just two. All must apply. So let's get into these scenarios and standards. Okay? So let's just talk about real quick the church itself. So we've gotten some questions. We've received some questions from some churches, church security teams, and they were asking questions about, hey, we've read online where there's going to be, people are going to come to the church and break out windows or burn the church down or whatever. I haven't specifically I haven't read that. I did read where I think earlier in the week or last week where someone said that like statues of white Jesus should come down because it's racist. And of course, we know that's just symbolic. Jesus wasn't white. Jesus was a Jew. And if we look at what everybody looked at, like, in the Middle East at that time, he probably had an olive complexion and dark hair, right? So there's some offense, I guess, taken that there's all these statues of white Jesus, right? Or Brentwood, I call it Brentwood Jesus. And so I haven't seen anything specifically about people burning down churches or tearing churches up, but I have seen something about these statues. So here's some things to think about when we start to talk about church security teams and churches and mobs or civil unrest. Number one, use the risk assessment tools that I talked about last week. So if you're on a church security team specifically, look at those, use those risk assessment tools to see what kind of protest is happening in your city or anything that's close to your church first. And then if you discover that something is going to happen close, or even if you're the target of a protest, think about the way that you mitigate that risk. And in this case, this would be to avoid it, right? So if I think something bad's going to happen, if someone's going to protest, or they're going to come on our property, or they're going to be close to the property, and there's going to be protests, and I think it's going to be civil unrest, maybe we close the church. Maybe we prep the church to, if we think there's going to be damage, we do things to put barriers, or we harden the church up, so if there is vandalism, it causes less damage. You know, everybody's streaming today, so instead of thinking about how we're going to defend the church, if you can use risk assessment tools and figure out when these things are going to happen, think about ways to avoid getting into those situations. When we start to talk about property, remember, there's not any state that I know of where I can use deadly force to actually defend property. Like if there's going to be property damage or vandalism, I can't use deadly force to stop that. Now, as a citizen in most states, including Tennessee, if I see a crime being committed, or if it's a more serious crime like a felony, if I've got reasonable cause to believe a felony has occurred, then I can make a citizen's arrest. So you have the right to do that in most states. If you see a crime, or if it's a more serious crime like a felony, and you have reasonable cause to believe it's occurred, you have the right to make that arrest. In the state of Tennessee, we have the right as a citizen, when we make that arrest, we have the right to use the amount of force that is reasonable to effect that arrest. But when we start to talk about risk mitigation, and very specifically avoidance, how bad do we want to get into that situation? Property can be replaced. We can always close the church. We can put barriers on the church. We can try to close the property off. We can call law enforcement. There are things that we can do if we know it's going to happen before, so we can do, or we can implement physical protection-wise, so we avoid the risk of having to use any kind of force whatsoever. It's property. It can be replaced. It is a building. The state does not recognize that it is a sacred place in the eyes of the law, and when we look at it, really, it is. It's a building. It is a business. Now, it is a church. As believers, as saints, it is. You know, I mean, it is. It is to us. It is our church. Christ is the head of the church, so it creates feelings when we think that somebody wants to destroy it. But again, it is property. Your church has insurance, okay? So think about risk avoidance or measures you can take to try to avoid things before they occur, and we talked about that last week. So just some thoughts for the church, okay? The next slide you're going to see, let's talk about risk assessment tools. So this is general just for citizens. What you are going to hear is, and I think this took place in Houston, I think it was last week. So there have been some protests in Houston. The Houston Police Department did some things like a lot of police departments around the country are doing, where the civil unrest is occurring, and they are staying out in the perimeter. They're not getting inside and getting involved in where the civil unrest is happening. So a woman with her child, they're in a car. I don't know the story behind it, but she's leaving. Her child's in the car. They are now in the middle of a mob. She calls 911. At first, she's pretty calm, and then, of course, they're on her vehicle. I don't know if they're trying to get in, and she gets upset. As you listen to what's happening, I want you to, again, pay attention, and then we're going to talk about the things that you heard on the video, and think about risk assessment, very specifically risk avoidance, avoiding this altogether. I don't know the situation, but again, if I know something's going to occur, if I look to see if something's going to happen, it's a good idea not to be in that location when it does, okay? And again, I don't know what happened with this young lady, why she was in that area, why she was in a car, why her children were there, but this is something that happened.
Fredericksburg 911, where's your emergency? Hi, I'm in downtown, and the protesters are blocking.
Which street?
Right at, Caroline.
Or do you see any businesses? Okay.
Yeah, and they're gesturing and they're blocking.
The city has sanctioned their protest, so we just have officers that can only monitor it. They can't do anything about it, but we recommend that
they're blocking. Get out.
Yeah, they're allowed to do that. They're allowed to do that per City Hall, so we would suggest that you report this to City Hall and make a complaint there, and that way they can do something about it, because right now they told our officers that we can't do anything about it.
How do I get out of here? I can't go backwards.
Yeah, I can't. Unless you're hurt or something or getting in an accident, our officers can't intervene and move.
I can't stay here all night, ma'am. You cannot do. I have a little girl in the car. You can't do that.
You just have to slowly get through the protest. I can't.
Okay, am I going to get arrested when I keep going? Because they're gesturing at my car.
As long as you don't hit any people, like, you're not allowed to hit people.
Well, I will. I absolutely will, and I need to get out of here.
Okay, ma'am, you cannot hit people with your car.
They're on my car. Right? They're on my car right now.
But we would suggest you slowly drive through the area. Don't hit anyone with your vehicle.
I cannot get out of here. Okay?
You have to be patient, but I'll let the officers know, okay?
Are you serious?
The city told us that we can't do anything, ma'am. The city told us that this is a sanctioned event.
That they're blocking people getting through to get out.
Yes, ma'am. The city's allowed that. We can't do anything about that. The police can't. So we're all very frustrated about this.
Get out of my car. This is going to get dangerous. I got a kid here.
Yes, ma'am. We would suggest that you call up City Hall to let them know about your frustrations, because we're all very frustrated.
This is getting scary. I cannot do
Or if you get into a side road or something, but yeah, there's nothing else you can do to get them out.
Get out of here, okay? Get out of the way. This is insane. Oh, they're on my car. They're on my car.
What kind of car are you in, ma'am?
Get out!
Ma'am, are they actually sitting on or standing in your car right now?
They're on my car! Right now!
What kind of vehicle are you in?
I'm in a black Highlander.
Alright, I'm going to let the officers know about that, okay? Hold on just a moment.
And I got a little girl in the car crying. Are you kidding me?
And your name real quick, ma'am, just for our records?
Sir Durant, this is insane.
Okay. Sure, thank you.
I'm out of it now. I just had...
Okay, you're out of there?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, ma'am, okay?
Okay. So what you heard was a woman, she's somewhere in this area. There's a protest, which sounded like civil unrest. They've blocked the streets, which is illegal. The police department, again, we don't know what happened, the planning around this, but very specifically, they've been told, they've sanctioned the event. No matter what happens, they are to stay outside of where the protest is occurring. They're blocking the car. She can't move. You hear that she gets upset. They're on top of the car. At some point, she gets out and she does get free of the protesters or the disruptors. But you noticed again, if you listened, a couple things. The dispatcher saying, there's nothing we can do. I told you last week, especially right now, the police cannot and will not protect you. We live in a republic, and right now that republic in certain areas is in upheaval. And so when we start to pay attention where these things are happening, I would want to stay clear of any protest whatsoever, even if it's believed to be peaceful. I don't want to put myself or anyone else that I care about in this situation. Now, again, I don't know the circumstances. I don't know where this woman was coming from. I don't exactly know how big this protest was. But again, there's a situation where this possibility this was announced, and we can use these risk assessment tools to understand where these are going to happen, and we stay clear of that area. She's told very clearly, obviously, unless her life's threatened or unless something happens, the police can't even get in there to do anything. One, because they're outnumbered, and two, right now, The people that, again, we're not talking about the individual police officers, but the people that are managing this are probably afraid to do it. So a good example of look to see where this is going to happen. Use those risk assessment tools before you go anywhere. Very specifically, if you're not paying attention, like you don't watch the news. And look, these come over Facebook feeds. They come over Twitter. I'd start to pay attention where these are going to happen. And if you're going places, especially in cities, where they're talking about tearing down statues or talking about protesting, know when these are going to occur so you don't put yourself in a situation like this. Okay? Again, we don't know what happened, but we do know how upsetting that got. And again, there was no one to help her. She was lucky to get out of there. Okay? We're going to talk about now defense from a vehicle. Let's talk about just some ideas. So here's the situation. You're going to hear the news say one thing, but what you don't see here is there's a person, and I think this is Seattle, that's in looks like a little black Honda. The mob is on the car. They're trying to block the car from going forward. And, in fact, they throw barriers and big pieces of steel to stop him. And someone jumps in the car and tries to reach in to get him. Now, remember we talked about, when we talked about ability, opportunity, and jeopardy. Under ability, one of the exceptions was disparity of force, and that could be a mob. It could be a large number of people. It could be a position of disadvantage, being in your car, you're in a confined space, someone's trying to reach in. So if you watch the full video, which I couldn't find the full video, I saw this last week, and now I can't find the full video. What we've got is a news clip, and so it's only showing parts of this. But someone reaches inside the car, tries to grab this guy and get him out, and this person is armed. And so you're going to see he defends himself. He gets out of the car. He very quickly tells everybody else to stay away from him, which they do. And what he does is I don't know if it shows it, but he walks his way through the crowd. He turns himself into police who are in the perimeter. They're outside of all this mess. They don't even know what's happening. So he uses deadly force. Okay? Don't know the ending to this, what happened with this person, if he was charged with anything, if he was cleared. But think about what we talked about, ability, opportunity, jeopardy. So ability is that capacity to cause death or serious bodily injury to you, somebody you care about, or that innocent person that you're trying to defend. That opportunity, circumstances surrounding the event are going to give that person that opportunity or that time to actually use that capability. And then that jeopardy, or what we talk about imminent jeopardy, it means that the adversary is going to use that ability and opportunity to possibly cause death or serious bodily injury to you or someone else. So think about those three things. And when we talk about ability, that disparity of force, number of people, being in a confined space or at a tactical disadvantage, when we start to think about those exceptions under ability. Okay?
See what we did? You just shot. Hold the line! Hold the line!
So somebody's got a gun.
Got a gun. Oh, God.
So when we think about this, again, what you don't see is someone did reach in and he's trying to escape. He's trying to avoid this. They put this piece of steel in front of him so he can't. And this appeared to be a last resort. This guy jumps in the car, trying to physically pull him out. He uses deadly force. And at that point, because he can't go anywhere, gets out of the car, he goes to the perimeter and turns himself in because the police are not inside. Okay? So again, think about that exception to ability, which in this case could have been at number one, he was at a disadvantage because of the confined space, and number two, because of the number of the people that were around him, they would not allow him to escape, and somebody's trying to physically pull him out of the vehicle. Okay? This is use of a vehicle. Think about our cars. Again, the average weight of a normal passenger car today is about 4,200 pounds. And so when we start to think about that use of a vehicle as a weapon or as a tool to get us out of something, again, remember, before we use that, we have to think about ability, we have to think about ability, opportunity, and then, of course, jeopardy, or what we would call that imminent jeopardy. Okay? So this is a situation where, again, a crowd surrounds a car. They won't, or actually somebody gets in front of it, they won't move. More people start to come up to the side of the car. Looks like they're attempting to get the person out of the car, and the person does use the car to drive through to get through that crowd.
This morning at Jefferson Square, protesters blocked the streets and police in riot gear cleared the crowd. During the incident, a protester was hit by a car. 17 people have been arrested, 5 cars towed, and a gun has been confiscated. Thanks for joining us here on WHAS 11 News at Noon. I'm Kristen Goodwillie. Now, we are going to show you 2 angles from the person who was hit by a car. This first angle that we're showing you is from a source sharing video from a rooftop in downtown near Jefferson Square. Now, it appears to show protesters walking up to a car, approaching the area where roads were blocked. The video shows them confronting the driver of a car, and then the car drives off and it hits a man as they drive away. Now, Louisville Metro Police sent out this angle, and this is from the street where they say protesters were engaging with a car on Liberty. They say as the car drives off, a protester was hit, and then other protesters chased the car down the street, which is when police say a protester pulled a gun on the driver. LMPD says they'd like to know who was driving the car so they can further investigate what happened and ask anyone with information to anonymously call their tip line at 574-LMPD.
All right, so a situation where someone's trying to get through a number of people, look like the news is calling it a mob. It looks like they come up to the driver's side of the vehicle. They're trying to get into the car. As this person tries to drive through, someone's blocking the vehicle, and they use that vehicle to drive through to get away. It sounds like there were people arrested. It sounds like they arrested the person with the gun, that actually the person that pulled the gun on the driver as the driver was trying to get away. So again, think about ability, opportunity, and jeopardy, but in this situation, also think about avoidance. Can we stay away from this type of a situation? So as you look at that video, did the adversaries have ability? When we talk about the capacity, it was a crowd, it was a mob. We didn't know it right away, but somebody in that mob had a gun. We couldn't see it from the angle. It's possible that driver did see that gun before we actually saw the angle that the news showed, that second angle. And so ability, obviously being in a position of disadvantage or disparity of force, was there, possibly. Okay, there was more than one person. Looks like they were trying to get into the car. And so again, he's in this bad position, a bad tactical or a tactical disadvantage. Then they block the car so he can't avoid, he can't escape. And then that person uses that car to get away, and in turn someone is hit. Again, sounds like there were arrests made, and then I don't know if they ever found the driver or not. So just some things to think about as we start to think about the vehicle. When can we use the vehicle as a tool of force? A vehicle is a tool of deadly force. A vehicle can cause death or serious bodily injury very, very quickly. All right, so now let's talk about attack by the mob. This is a situation in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, where some protesters are actually, they're violating the law because they're vandalizing, they're tearing the statue down. And if I understand the story correctly, there was a group there that was opposing that. The gentleman that you're going to see getting attacked was in the group that was opposing this. I don't know what happened before, but at some point this turns into a physical escalation, or this physically escalates. He tries to avoid, he tries to get away. They chase after him. They start to assault him. At some point you're going to see he pulls a firearm and he uses deadly force. Now here's what happened with this situation. Albuquerque PD quickly arrested him. I think within 24 hours he was released. Those charges were either dropped or deferred. Albuquerque, the city of Albuquerque, was told to stand down by the state. The state then took over the investigation, and it's my understanding that now everything has been dropped because this was a self-defense case. This is where, number one, a number of adversaries, there was ability there. There was more than one adversary. Okay? So there was more than one. So there was ability or the capacity, because you're going to see they're assaulting him with skateboards and some other kind of blunt object. At some point, you can't see it in the beginning, but someone right before this guy uses deadly force pulls a pistol and shoots. One of the protesters pulls a knife. You can also hear they're threatening to kill him. So obviously, opportunity was there. Distance, obviously the ability was there because of the weapons, the blunt objects. And then, of course, he realizes that he is in jeopardy or imminent jeopardy of losing his life. He uses deadly force. But understand this. Again, I talked about this at the beginning of the presentation. Look, I don't agree with this going on, but I'm going to stay away from this as much as I can. Because if I get put into a situation, even if I'm justified in using deadly force, he was arrested, he was charged, and there are a number of days he had to go through that process before he was finally cleared because of everything that's happening. So you're going to be held, the court that you're going to have to go up against is that court of public opinion. So he was arrested very quickly, thrown in jail, charged with these things. He's released. State takes control of it. And then again, I think now everything has been dropped or they've been dismissed. But you still have to go, or he had to go through that process in what appears to be a justifiable use of deadly force. Okay?
Kill you!
So obviously, very quickly, it looks like ability, opportunity, and jeopardy, all three of the elements are there, plus you had a number of people attacking him. He was attacked with blunt objects. At some point, a knife came out, and it sounds like, based on what has happened over the last couple of days, this was justified. He was released. Again, risk avoidance. I think he was part of the crew that was there that was opposing the protesters. You have the right to do that, but understand when you put yourselves in these situations, this is something that you might have to do. And as a citizen, if you use deadly force, again, you're going to have to articulate, you're going to have to explain and prove why you did what you did. Was number one, it was righteous. We talked about that word righteous, and you were innocent. Okay? All right, folks, Scott and I have to run out of here. Send your questions to us at Safe with Man on Facebook or Instagram. You can send us messages through michaelmannsecurityservices.com, or you can give Scott a call, 615-606-1006, or you can always email Scott at scottm, SCOTTM, at michaelmannsecurityservices.com, or you can get me at contact@michaelmannsecurityservices.com. Hey, thanks for joining us. A whole lot of information in a short amount of time. We went over what we assumed we would go over. I think we went over our time a little bit, but we hope you got something out of this, especially the church security teams, and above all the citizens out there asking these questions. All right, folks, and remember the most important thing, it's about prevention, not response.